Okay, so we are now ready for the final talk of the day, and very happy to announce Peter Bilak, and we're also very happy that we were able to convince Peter to come all the way from The Hague to Bielefeld again, because he's been here before. Really loved and used your fonts, and I'm always curious to hear about your latest ventures. And last time you brought us Works That Work, and today you're going to talk about something else, which I'm very happy about. Now I would like to briefly introduce Peter Bilak. Peter Bilak's work in the field of editorial, graphic, and type design. He started Typography in 1999, and in 2000, together with Stuart Bailey, co-founded art and design journal ... In 2012, he started Works That Work, a magazine for unexpected creativity, and co-founded Font Stand, a font rental platform, in 2015, together with Andrei Kratky. Is that correct? Okay. He also collaborates with the choreographer Lucas Timolak on creation of modern dance performances, and together they started MakeMoveThink.org, a foundation for interdisciplinary artistic collaborations. Peter's doing really a lot of ventures. The list goes on, and he's also teaching at the Type and Media, which is a postgraduate course at the Royal Academy of Arts. This time, Peter will do us a favor and talk about type design and how type designers can find a unique position in the field of type design. Please welcome the one and only Peter Bilak.
Thank you. Well, this must be disappointing to see me here when expecting Irma Bohm to stand here and talk about books. And I don't have any books to show. Well, anyway, you have to deal with it. My background is type design, and I've designed some typefaces. But for some reason, I realized that for the last 5 years or something, I've been always talking about dance and about magazines. And I somehow divulged. I didn't talk about type too much. I continued working with type, and it's been my passion and work for more than 20 years. But I always enjoyed seeing type in wider context, and the magazine or other activities allowed me to find that bigger context. But tonight, Dirk has asked me to talk about type, so I will stick to it, and I'll be talking about type. There are several things which I find interesting about type design, and one of the reasons why I find type design quite fascinating discipline as opposed to other disciplines is that how lasting it is. When you engage with type design, you're dealing with history one way or the other, because you're working with histories of the alphabet, you're working with history of printing technologies, history of different languages, and with the history of work of other people that you inherit, and you're building up on work of other people. But possibly, we're also creating, when you work with type design, you're possibly creating something that is very lasting. I've been just reading, when you read books, often when you try to identify typefaces that you look at, these typefaces are not always new. I was just reading a book about technology, really very cutting-edge technology from Silicon Valley, but the book would be typeset in the typeface from 15th century. How come we have something that is so lasting that centuries from now it still continues being useful? And it is my hope that if we do our job well, that our work can continue being useful for decades or possibly centuries to come. Well, that's a very ambitious aim, but there's always possibility. I take time seriously. This is a calendar that is in my studio. What you don't really see, it's a big A0 poster, and there are dates. If you zoom in closely, they're all the dates of the 21st century. So I have a calendar, and every time I go to the office, I cross my mark. So it allows you to see things in the wider perspective, that most of my work is very long term. And it puts you nicely on the ground to see that time here is quite short compared to other things. So this kind of longer term and contextual term look at things has been always part of my work. Another reason why I like type, and I'll get to type slowly, is that it works on intersection of different disciplines. Type design is necessary, or letters are necessary to materialize language. Language without letters is fleeting, and it doesn't. It exists, but the moment you say it, it's gone, and it's interesting. But we don't have any records of it, and for most part of the history, people have been speaking but not really writing. All these records of writing are only 5,000 years old, which, considering the history of civilization, is a very small fraction. Again, if you imagine this timeline, we've been writing for a very, very short time. So the alphabet and type allowed us to create memories and histories. Type always works also with technology, and has always been linked to technological innovation and technological progress, advancements. And finally, there's design. Type. There's a lot of craft and design in the process of type design. But if you look at these three things separately, you study design and you study technology and you study language in separate places. You rarely find a place which would deal with linguistics and talk about technology deep, about the implications of technology, and talk about design at the same time. And this is why finding the intersection of it is actually quite rare. So on one hand, we see type everywhere. On the other hand, to do it, there's actually very few type designers who do work that have impact. I mentioned that I'm active. I've been working with magazines for a long time, and it's something I very much enjoy working with, being the editor of a magazine. But I do find overlaps in running a publication and running a type foundry, where you run a type foundry called Typotech. And there are a lot of similarities in the process of working. It's not always only about making stuff. It's about making sense of making stuff. This is what the editing process is about. When we work with the magazine, most of the work is about how to contextualize, how to be able to tell that story to people. With type design, it's the same thing. We're looking for stories to say. So these typefaces often, they're not just nice curves and beautiful letters, but they represent some kind of story that we would like to tell to people. And it's actually a collaborative process that you need the editor to find a way how to tell that story to people. Sometimes you need more elements or less elements to say it. And often, it's a back and forth process. So unlike being an individual type designer who just finishes things and puts them out, a type foundry does, it goes through the publishing, editing process, which is very similar to any publishing activity. And in fact, if I think of our studio, I think we are a publishing company by now. We publish all kinds of different things. We publish books, magazines, and typefaces, and we hope to find users, and create value for them. I'll show you some examples, and especially examples of things which are not made only by myself, because, but more where my position is that of a publisher, where I recognize something that I find really interesting, and it's really interesting to see what kind of material makes it into, if you look at this, first, well, it's nice graphic, but there's something else that made me interested in this. So this is a work of Shiva Nalapumeral, who's an Indian designer, young one, 25 years of age. But he created this system of letters which blurs the boundaries between what is a typeface and what is almost like graffiti-like, something like lettering, which cannot be made. And it's inspired by Kufi typography, which is the geometric architectural styles that you can find in some places in the Middle East. In Kufi typography, the link between the white and black, it's completely linked. Like you see, there's an equal amount of the gaps, the white gaps are, it creates a maze-like structures. They're intertwined and interconnected. There's not more of white or more of black. It's just precise balance of forms. And Shiva managed to do the same thing with type, which is difficult. Normally, if you write a word, you would just have gaps between letters. And it wouldn't, this is how normal letters look like, because they have the individual shapes and envelopes. But he would try to look for ways how to minimize them and create the equal amount of space around letters. which, it's easy to draw one sample, but it's very difficult to make sure that it works for everything, because there's just so many exceptions. The Roman alphabet is very diverse, and if you imagine 26 letters combined with 26 other letters, it's an impossible number of combinations to deal with. But this is what exactly Shiva has made, together with Tal Lemming, who's a fellow type designer, but also programmer. We created a system that would build these ligatures based on certain rules. And a single font that does something like this would have to contain about 5,000 letters to allow, again, minimizing, creating perfect structure of black and white. So there's some logic built into it. There's a behavior built into it. And that would make it interesting. So it's not only about, again, nice letters, but it's about creating something larger than this. That it's quite systematic way of thinking. That you forget about individual shapes, but you're looking at, systems behind it. It's probably also the only font that the entire word potato is a ligature to allow for this structure. And together with layers, it becomes kind of crazy form. So you get, I think there's 6 different layering styles. Each need to include 5,000 ligatures, which is, again, just crazy to consider. It will take years to develop. And then it becomes this tool, possibly, that can allow doing something for people like you. Another recent example, these are 2 typefaces we published this year. We publish, a few typefaces a year, and they all appear very simple. So this one looks very simple, but there's a lot of, and we tend to think that serious typefaces are the text-based typefaces where there's a lot of research behind it. But we like to kind of take seriously also the fun things. So it's a fun layering font, but there's as much research or as much work behind it as anything else. We like to take fun seriously. This is also, again, a simple thing, but took seriously and made by my partner, Nikola Jurek. And we looked at standards. We always kind of were fascinated, both of us, by standards, standardizations, and norms, and what it means. Let's see. And one thing that you recognize, especially, it's probably no longer in use, but these lettering architectural stencils, they almost fell out of use, but you've probably seen them, you come across, and there's a charm. On one hand, it's handmade. On the other hand, it's trying to reduce the expression of a hand. It's driven by standards and norms. There are many different types of them. Each country has its own norms, and each decade has its own norm. And we published this article, which I need to thank Florian Harwig and Thomas Meyer, who made all the research. And it's a long article with all the examples of historical developments of lettering. And based on this, we would create a system of fonts. And again, not just one typeface, but this is actually, I'm not counting as well, I think 14 subfamilies and about 60 different fonts which react to different types of stencils which are there. And it's actually quite complex work to make it work. And again, there's a layering system around it. And there's, again, behavior, because many of these letters are parametric, and they can be, they can be controlled by variables. So for example, the slant is controlled by just, the additional angle. So we try to, again, build this behavior into typefaces. And they are fun things, but again, pushed to the very limit. I'll talk about some of, in these projects like Calcula or Plotter, I work as the editor. I'm making suggestions and I'm working with the authors. Here, this would be my process, my project, an older one, but also shows that we always hope to produce something which hasn't been there, which is difficult. But I think designers want to do this. Want to do work that hasn't been there. But if you look at how type is made, we all draw in the same software, and you draw in a grid of fixed number of units. So the possibilities of doing the same are actually quite large. If you're drawing simple letter like an I or an O, it's very likely that if we all would draw right now like just one letter, it would be the same. So what are the differences? I think the differences is the meaning behind the letters and the context and connotations. And this is what this project is about. It's not about only actual forms, but what these forms do represent. So this person, it's the same person on both slides. Henry William Pratt was a British actor who moved to America in search for his acting career, and he lived in Hollywood, and he would assume his artistic name Boris Karloff. So he suddenly would change his identity, and then his most famous role was the Frankenstein. So you get that one person with the triple personality, like back home in England under a different name, then in Hollywood under a different name, and then finally his movie role, a different name. And I found it something quite interesting how, we talk about personalities and characters in type, and how these personalities can change also. Like it's the same person, but with shifting personality all the time. Some time ago, I was invited to do a talk about conceptual typography, and I speculated, what typefaces could be made purely conceptually, some not very practically. And I was trying to identify what could be the most beautiful example of type ever made. And an example which I was mentioning, and it was not subjectively just chosen by me because I like different typefaces, but looking at his history of type, what has been very enthusiastically accepted at the time of publishing. And it was, the Bodoni's work was very much accepted mainly because of improvement of printing technology. He perfected the printing techniques. A lot of the type designers at that time, they were printers or they were linked with printers. So often their work was not as much only about shapes, but about making sure that the shapes are reproduced well. So improvement of printing technology allowed them to make the difference between thick and thin to be very extreme. And today, this extreme thick and thin contrast, we often there are connotations between high-end fashion and this. So a lot of the high-end fashion brands use these kind of forms that you recognize. And then I was looking for some of the ugliest examples of type ever made, which is probably more fun. We're always attracted by ugliness. You just look at this and you don't understand how it is made. And these forms are made in a very short time of history, probably only a decade or two in England. And for some reason it's called Italian. It has nothing to do with Italy. I think the English just called like this, because they found it really ugly. But it was made at the time of the Industrial Revolution, when there has been so much type already made that you could not make additional difference. People competed on making it darker and heavier or wider, and at one point you just could not make it heavier and darker to attract more attention of readers. So there's been this short-lived trend that the attention of readers was attracted not by making it nicer, but making it actually uglier. So you look at it because it's so ugly. It's kind of repulsive attraction that you just look at it because it's so strange. And at the time, it was, or even later, it was rejected by historians and considered to be like a completely unnecessary trend and something that should not be part of history. And it's interesting to see about to study reception of historical typefaces. What I found interesting in this is that the actual difference between the two, it's not so large. So if we look at this closely, the one, the beautiful example, Bodoni or Didot's work, it's using just a very simple skeleton and high contrast. And if you look at the other one, it's the same skeleton and same high contrast. So type design can be broken down to a number of different parameters. Type designers work with these parameters, to represent the width and weight and horizontal and vertical proportions, the stroke width, type of serifs. Type design can be broken down to maybe 50, 60 parameters. And the difference between these two things is just one out of many parameters, and it's the angle of the pen, how you hold the pen. Everything else is the same. So you draw it the same way, you just change the angle, and it results in quite dramatical difference. And although there's no connection between Bodoni and the Italians, I did make it. So I would draw beautiful example of recreating something that I would normally never make, because I'm not so much interested in reviving history. If something has been made, it's great. But I made this to anticipate something else that we could make with it. So I had to make a convincing example of nice type. And a friend of mine, Peter van Rosmalen, helped me. And then after making it, and there's some compromises in it because it anticipates the next thing, we would make the ugly one. So creating something that, again, is reinterpreting the trend from 1830s. It's not exactly that, but again, with some compromises, because we can allow doing this. So you can have a slider where you can decide, between beauty and ugliness, and where exactly it stops being beautiful and where it starts being ugly again. So there's something interesting about when you blur these things and create something that could not have existed before. And if you interpolate it, you realize that you get a perfectly neutral example of type, which is, if you take any two extremes, always the middle one will be the boring one. It's interesting on the sides, but not in the middle. I think I have a short video that presents it.
For millennia, mankind has endeavored to capture the ideals of beauty. We have sought it in divine proportions, symmetry, and harmony. We struggle to define it, yet we know it instantly if we see it.
Ugliness is different. It assaults our expectations, violates all canons, twists conventions. Ugliness repels us, yet also commands our voyeuristic attention.
Karloff is the convergence of beauty and ugliness.
The nexus between the extremes.
The manifestation of their common ground.
Ugliness and beauty intertwined.
This is Karloff.
Well, yeah, it has a name. I'll talk about the most serious project. Although, I don't really see a difference. We often get into projects without, when we find substance in it, and people always ask me if we kind of consider if we can sell it or not. We hope to sell it, but it's not the main motivation for doing work like this. And this also it's a quite systematic approach into type, but completely different. So Greta started 10 years ago with the serif typeface, and then a few years later I made the sans version. And we always, there's Fritz here, and he knows about type and media. In type and media, we always talk about, not waiting till you finish one typeface, but drawing always versions of it at the same time, because your design happens not in one letter or in few letters, but it happens across different styles. Your design is basically the recipe, how you see things. And similarly, when I draw type, I don't wait till it's finished to start, the bold weight, but you consider its expressions across different weights and across different widths. And this is when design happens. Again, if you only look at certain letters, they can be similar to something else, but across the whole spectrum, you can actually express different types of ideas. So this is how it worked normally, from the very beginning, working on extremes. Doing the thinnest possible, doing the regular one, and doing the heaviest possible. And often, this is inspired by foundational work by Adrian Frutiger. I do consider his universe to be one of the most important design of the 20th century. I think we have more beautiful examples of type, but this is a very systematic way where Frutiger would organize the space around it, and he would design the intervals, the spaces between them, and decide very systematically about how wide something should be, when there should be several other widths and several other weights. He would even propose the unique naming system. So it's the first digit determines the width, and the second digit determines the weight. A very clever way that allows knowing exactly what you're going to get. So similarly, with type, I'm always working with the design space, and I'm trying to fill the design space. And these are some of the masters which are designed. So I would design the extremes. I would start with the middle one, and then create the lightest and the heaviest one, and then doing the widest and the narrowest ones. Still not knowing what would be useful. The middle things can be interpolated. So with the help of 9 masters, you can populate it and create a lot more. So this would be the interpolation work. But at one point you see that all the bottom ones are not very useful. They're just pushing the limits, and they probably never find application. So at one point, again, with the editing process, you realize what can be useful and what not. So while we designed a lot more, we decide later what is useful to publish and what maybe needs to be added later. So the very wide at the right-hand corner, that was added later when we recognized there is actually more space for it. And this is the resulting work. And what is interesting about the systematic way of working with type is that there's a danger. There's a danger that if you work on too many things at the same time, there are too many compromises, because you kind of think about a very heavy one, and you take in you're neutralizing some of the characteristics in the middle. So in order to make it work, you're creating system, but you're also creating exceptions to that system where you recognize when things don't work. So for example, the round dots work really well on heavier weights, but in very light weights, they would become too small, so they wouldn't just work. You could use the square dots everywhere, but I did find them to be much nicer. So you have to break the rhythm, something that make exception to the whole system. Use something else. My G's would work fine, what we call the double story G's. But when it's really narrow, suddenly there's no room for more complex shapes. So again, you have to make exceptions and recognize where the limits of your own system. So it's both creating system and then breaking it at the same time in order to create something which works in each of the styles and not just in some. So the result is that some of these fonts work as text typefaces, some of work as display typefaces, and it's interesting to see how continuously there is a continuous rhythm between display and text typography. And yeah, we take again, we are very systematic about symbols, so we make sure that we have enough of them and in all the weights that we need to make. So they also exist in 10 different weights. And we make sure that it works with different languages. So this is Cyrillic, and there's Greek, and there are many more. I think there's more. I think there's a Devanagari missing, which I'll show you later. So this is Greta. What am I trying to say? Yes, I think I'm going to start talking about non-Latin type. Together with Christian Sarkis, who's another former student of Type and Media in The Hague, we started a specialized type foundry for Arabic type, because we noticed that there haven't been typefaces made, or if there have been typefaces made, they were made as a translation of something, but not as original, authentic Arabic types. So our intention was to work with original Arabic type. But we also did the version of Greta, which at the time when we started, there haven't been any compressed or condensed or extended styles, or there had never been examples of 10 different weights with Arabic. It simply did not exist. So we felt that it was important to make sure that we create something like this, because in Arabic type, you have less means to create typographic hierarchies. You don't have the italics, you don't have small caps, you don't have many of those other things that we take for granted in the Western world. So actually having enough weights and different weights is useful to create hierarchies in type. Well, this is how it looks like. And we push the system further, and so this is Devanagari version. Which is a bit crazy, to make it, because Devanagari is so dense in structure. But again, there's a lot of value in it for local designers, that it allows people in different parts of the world to take their languages as seriously as anything else, because before often they would have just 1, 2, 3 typefaces, and now they can find a unique voice for the type. The question I often receive is this, can you as a foreigner create, a Greek or Arabic or other language version of a typeface? And it's an interesting question. And there are many different ways how to talk about it. We often talk about it with our students, and we make assignments about understanding what it takes. I think a good comparison is talking about translation. I think any text can be translated by a translator. And usually the translator is not native to all languages. He just have a good understanding of vocabulary, of a culture, of history. And in order to translate a book from one language to another one, again, you master one language, but you have a good knowledge of the other one. In the same way, I do believe that it is possible as a non-native designer to create typefaces for someone else, but it's a lot more time-consuming. You need to do a lot more homework to make it happen. You need to have map the possibilities of the language, have a good understanding of culture, because often forms, they have their signifiers. They refer to something that you may not understand. So a lot of the projects which I'm showing, they are long-term projects which started many, many years ago and allowed us to understand it over the time. You learn a new language, a new way of thinking. The other ways to look at it, in type design, the human eye is the same for all human beings. So the black and white are interpreted in the same way. So a lot of the optical rules that we use is universal for all languages. It's something else which is not universal. It's the cultural values. And also there's a difference between reading and viewing. And this one, my favorite examples to illustrate it is this. Josep Eduard Pradell was a Spanish printer from 18th century, and he's one of the finest type designers or type founders of the era. He would produce, the typefaces for the King of Spain at the time, and his typefaces are used until today. His work has been digitized, and it's often used in editorial newspaper typography now. It is, this is the work that we would have made, and it's still continually being used. An interesting fact about Pradell is that Pradell was illiterate. He was not able to read. Still, he was able to draw beautiful typefaces because he had a good understanding of rhythm, proportions, and other things. So it shows you the difference between reading and viewing, and that they're completely different processes. And that's how I feel about working with non-Latin or other typefaces, that you need to do your homework to understand possible pairs and how they combine. But I don't always understand exactly the meaning of the words. You're just looking at the clusters of letters. I'm going to talk about a recent thing, something we launched actually this week. And it's an entirely new program working with Hebrew typography. You see, we spent 10 years working with Arabic, and it was a fascinating journey, and I learned a lot about Semitic writing. And I always thought that, and it would be useful to look at another Semitic writing script, which is Hebrew. But of course, there are conflicts in the Middle East, and if someone understands Arabic who would not necessarily work with Hebrew, and vice versa. So it takes an outsider to look at this and to make sure that, if we have the Arabic, that we would create a matching system for Hebrew that would work equally well. Another motivation is that when I spoke to my friends in Israel, and I spoke about newspaper typography, they tell me that there are only 3 fonts used in books, magazines, and newspapers in Israel today. They all 3 are quite old typefaces. The Frangerul, he was a German Jew who designed it. It's the most common newspaper typeface, the top one. You find it in most of the papers in Israel. And there's been nothing made since that would be equally useful. The other 2 are more recent one after the foundation of the State of Israel. But if you look at legibility typefaces made for continuous text or long reading in small sizes, it's basically 3 options for designers. I found it really fascinating because if I look at any other writing script, if I look at Latin, it's actually work made in the last 10 or 15 years, which is the most dominant one. There's been so much good typefaces made in the last 15 years that can be seen everywhere. But for some reason with Hebrew type it's not the case. They kept using the same thing. And although it's not easy, I thought maybe it's worth looking at this. Is it possible to create a legibility typeface that can be used in small sizes for continuous text, for Hebrew? And we started with this. I took my Greta serif as a starting point, and I'm showing this as a bad example. I started the process in 2010, so 7 years ago. And I remember I made this thing in an hour. In an hour, I would draw, the Hebrew is very simple. It appears at first, it's 22 letters. Once you know how to draw shapes, I can draw very quick. I would make this in an hour or 2, except I would be not able to say if it's good or not. I made it, and I look at it well, I have no idea what I just made. I made something that looks foreign to me, but without having any understanding of how to improve it. I knew that's probably not good because it would be too easy if I could make it in 2 hours. But I wasn't able to how to improve it. And that's a curious thing that to be able to draw is a different thing as to having understanding what to draw. So, and I think it's the reason why it took 7 years to finish. So this typeface started 7 years ago, but it was published this week after 7 years, where I finally, I think, acquired some understanding of what should be changed and how. The thing that took me the longest was to recognize that some of the conventions of the type as I know it is deeply rooted in Latin, and it's very hard to unlearn it and to throw away and not apply my Latin or Western-centric view on something else. It's really difficult. It's a bit like, when you... have you seen this video of someone learning to ride a bike, but with the reverse shift that if you turn left, it goes right, actually? And it becomes really tricky because you're trying to go this way, but you have to go that way in order to go this way. It's very difficult because your brain is learned to do certain motions, and you cannot unlearn it very quickly. It takes you a long time to do it. And this is the same way you would feel about this. You just reverse contrast, reverse proportion is very difficult to master. One thing we just struggled the most was how to deal with stroke endings, what we call the serifs. There are no serifs in Semitic type, or actually there's no serifs in non-European type. Serifs is a Western invention which is used for Latin. Even if you look at Greek typography, there are no serifs. If you look at the Middle Eastern typography, no, there are no serifs. If you look in India further, there are calligraphic stroke endings, but it's something different than serifs. So to figure out what to do with it, it would take a lot of trials and finding out some kind of logic that you can rely on. I remember drawing these alepphs endlessly and trying to see what can you do with it. The typeface that I was trying to make was a serif typeface, except you could not use serifs to make it. So it's a kind of contradiction to, you should feel like serif, but it should not have actual serifs. None of these were actually good, and they could not be used. Again, it's just like you have to do a lot of mistakes to be able to understand why they're wrong. And the longest time in the process is understanding when something works, when not. Again, the actual drawing things is trivial. It goes very, very fast. But to be able to analyze and learn from it, that's what takes longer time. So I think the key thing in drawing type for languages which are not your own is allowing plenty of time to learn along with this. It's a bit like learning a new language. You won't learn it very, very quickly. You learn a few phrases, but it will take you some time to master the language before you can express something unique. Further studies of the serifs, which didn't go anywhere. If I look at this, so this is the typeface I was working with, which is actually a popular newspaper typeface by now. I drew it 10 years ago. I think by now maybe there's 50 newspapers which use it. So it's a newspaper hardcore, like a typeface. But to make it, like into something else in Hebrew is challenging, because you cannot use these heavy stroke endings. And this was what I made after a long time. Series, like a stroke endings that felt natural in Hebrew, and like creating shapes that I'm trying to remember. This is maybe after 4 years of working that I would be comfortable enough to look at this and go like, it doesn't feel foreign. It looks like there are not too many mistakes in it, but that doesn't mean it's very, very good. It means that it's just by eliminating mistakes, it's a bit like learning a grammar of a language, but you're still not able to express something unique because you're just doing something without faults, which doesn't mean that you do something valuable. The problem was that if I would compare the two, they would just not have the same expressions. I think one felt different than the other. It spoke with a different voice. And I think this is made later. This is, I think, when I made it more expressive. This was kind of toned down version. So a year or two later I made this. This is last year. And I think this is when I hit the wall and saying like, well, I don't think I can make it in something else. And for the first time it occurred to me that I do need to work with a local designer, which I resisted for the longest time. I did most of this on my own, just allowing plenty of time and reading books. At that time, I was invited to do a workshop in Jerusalem at one of the art schools, and I met local designers, and one of them, Michal Sahar, she became really interested in this. And so this is before, and after collaboration with her, she would make a number of very small adjustments, but the critical ones that it made it feel really like what it was before. So this is, I think this is a version that we published with quite unorthodox versions, things which I would not do myself. The Aleph, which is, this is actually quite daring, something I did not dare to do myself because I was really too much tied by conventions. I was afraid to make mistakes. And it took a native designers to kind of break this and to make it into something more. Another thing that she proposed, and which I didn't dare to do at the time, was that I start any project which I work with non-Latin, I start usually by analyzing the handwriting. I find handwriting analysis useful because it allows you to show how people naturally express things without any use of technology. Many times, and especially in other parts of the world, technology deformed typography in places. For example, in India, they use the same linotype machines as here, except that for index scripts you need a lot more letters, so they have to simplify actually the printed typography to make it work, which means that they would introduce mistakes, but something that people would get used to. Something that you don't do when you write by hand. You don't think about technological limitations. So I always found it interesting to see how people express things naturally without the use of technology to be able to kind of work with this. Except in Hebrew, the handwriting is completely different from printed type. Completely different. I collected samples, look at them, look at where people are coming from. I couldn't find keys to this. But it led to creation of a secondary script for Hebrew, which is very uncommon. You don't have, again, the idea of italic is a Western invention. It doesn't exist in other parts of the world. But people write with cursive handwriting everywhere. So we created a cursive version of Hebrew, which could be combined as a secondary script for continuous writing. Something like this existed, but only for headlines. But we made it work for small text. And this is in combination with our Arabic, where you create system that works across different cultures, but preserves the same voice, and introducing the idea of italic, cursive, I mean. Of course, Fedra Sans followed, and I worked on it at the same time, but I did want to start working with the serif first because I found it to be a lot more difficult. I knew that after we managed to do the hardcore newspaper typeface, the sans would be actually quite easy, which was like a not easy but easier than the type. So this is 40 styles of Greta Sans. And I mentioned that this interest was not to create just one typeface, but to create an entire program of Hebrew typefaces. Parmigiano is our version of Bodoni. We made it, it's two Italians, Riccardo Olocco and Jonathan Pierini, launched it maybe 4 years ago. It comes in 4 different optical sizes. Optical sizes are the ones which are optimized for different point size. We made it work for Hebrew, which is, I think, unprecedented to have this. And it has the cantillation marks, which indicate how to sing, which is also quite unusual today. I don't think there are many fonts which do this. So we launched this week, not 1 or 2 typefaces, but a collection of 21 different typefaces. All of them work with Hebrew, and all of them work with Arabic, which was something that we really want to do as a statement, that you can have something that works across different cultures, which may not be even compatible cultures. A lot of these things, again, we do without clients. We do this thing because I found it important. We sometimes spend time working on some of the Cyrillic accented letters, which are used by marginal languages in Siberia. When I did statistics, I spent a few weeks designing letters for language which is spoken by 120 people in Siberia. It's not many. The chance that they will use is very, very small. But still, I found it important that in a rate that we know that every day a language disappears, and currently we have about 7,000 languages spoken in the world. There are estimates that 90% of these languages will disappear by the end of the century because they're being replaced by the dominant languages. Part of it is the migration. People travel and they lose their own languages. But there are also practical reasons. Some cultures don't have the tools, technologies, and books to be able to write and express themselves. And this is part of the reason why we continue doing this, which is beyond just the pure commercial interest, because no one is paying us really to do this, but still we find it that it's an important contribution and part of my work. So the things we do, magazines or typefaces, we publish, and we hope to that it finds its users and people will use it one way or the other. But I recognize that creating something like this, which is, Greta Sans works, it's 80 different fonts supporting over 250 languages with so many different glyphs, which has been basically 10 years of work, to cover all these different writing scripts. It's a crazy amount of work. This is how do you find a mechanism that it pays back for it? Because for us it's an investment, like a publisher. Publishers make investment. You publish books, and you hope by selling these books you recover the money so you can publish new books. With type it's the same thing. We publish typefaces, and we hope that over the time people will use it, buy it, and it will bring the money back so we can continue doing other things. Except what happens is that people just go to Google, and of course the first instinct is this. And I'm not complaining. I understand. I've done the same thing when I was a student, of course. It's surprisingly easy. You get 300,000 results in half a second. So why not trying it? But of course, it's frustrating. But I do think that it's something that designers should address as well. I think that part of the creativity that we do is not only designing new things, but also finding a way how people can use it. And this is a quote of Steve Jobs, is what, I think their work with iTunes would change piracy as we know it. And there's evidence to it. So when, in early days, if you would make anonymous surveys, 80% of people would say they illegally downloaded films and movies, just 8 years ago. Today, it's not so common. People don't bother doing it because there are easier way to do it. So, for example, Spotify or iTunes or other things, they bring technological solution to something which was, before difficult. Now, instead of looking for illegal things on the internet, spending many, many hours on it, I could just pay a small fee and get something out of it. So this is a technological solution, except that you need to look beyond technology, because if you look at how these streaming platforms work, often they don't really compensate the makers. There are people who say that the musicians never get money out of all the streaming services. So while we get used to streaming services and it's a dominant way to consume music, the money flows one way and not the other way back to musicians. This is an interesting chart of if you're a musician and you want to earn a minimal salary, which is $1,000, you can either sell 143 self-produced CDs and you make this minimum salary, or you need to have 4 million Spotify streams, and you need to do it every month to do it, which there are 8 artists which have over 4 million Spotify streams. So you have a million artists on Spotify, and 8 of those can make a living, and everyone else, they have to find a different way how to make money. It's a complicated story. I could go on about it because we made some research for longer, but I'm not going to bother you with this. It's something that we considered when we think about font licensing, why piracy happens, and how to find a solution to this that would bring a value to the users, but also to the makers, a fair way how everyone can use something. And this is what we did. When we produced FontStand. FontStand is a desktop application which works pretty much like iTunes, except it's for fonts. You can look for fonts. If you find something, in the same way how you can listen to music or watch the trailer or a film, you can try things for an hour. So if you click a button, it's one button, it's installed in the application, and you can start trying it. And it's as simple as you see it. It will just take a few seconds. And we hope by making it much easier, again, you eliminate the piracy because it will take you just so much longer to find a pirated version of that font. And then you can rent the font for 1 month. So instead of spending hundreds of dollars or euros, you could just use it for 1 month for one project, which makes it also a lot more accessible and affordable. We do this because my interest is to draw type, but I can only continue drawing type when we find a way how the money can flow both ways back to the makers. And I would wish that someone else would make this, but since no one else would make it, you have to do it yourself. That would allow to do your work on a daily basis. One thing I notice is that students, particularly, are the most creative ones when it comes to not paying for fonts. And again, I completely understand this. And what is just a bit sad is that instead they start using free Google fonts, which not always great, and it changes the work. Because suddenly they have to use kind of the B level fonts. That's why we created another thing. We work with 50 different foundries, which we consider to be some of the best ones. So. But we created a student program for FontStand where we give actually credits to students, so you don't have to look for illegal fonts. We'll give it to you, and hoping that you get used to good fonts. And once you get used to good things, you'll never use bad things again. Okay, it's a simple kind of hope for us. So if you sign up there, you hopefully it will create a value for you too. If you want to know more about type, I actually brought some type specimens with me, so they are there. And I'm done. Thank you.